I used to think schedules could save a life. You pour rebar on the right day, pour concrete on the next one, let it cure, keep the trucks from chewing up the site, and a building stands because you didn't miss anything small. I'm a project manager in construction, which is a fancy way of saying I'm paid to make sure grown men with expensive equipment show up where they said they would, when they said they would, and to glue 1,000 details into a structure you can walk through without fear. If I can sequence a hospital wing or a mixed-use podium, surely I can sequence a marriage. That's what I used to believe. I didn't understand yet that love is a trade with no inspections and very few permits, and that family loyalty, well, the soil under that slab was never compacted right. My brother Tyler arrived 2 years after me with dimples and a laugh that made old ladies at church give him peppermints. Mom called him her miracle baby, which is something you should never say within earshot of the non-miracle child. She did anyway. I don't think she meant harm, she just loved applause and he produced it. Tyler was the kid who could cut class and talk the vice principal into a recommendation letter. He was that charming. By high school, the pattern was muscle memory. If I got an A, Mom told Dad I was responsible. If Tyler passed a quiz he forgot to study for, we threw a cookout. I learned to be my own audience. We grew up in Aurora, just east of Denver, in a split-level house that smelled like laundry and oregano. Dad poured foundations for a living and came home covered in dust the color of a storm. He loved us equally, in the quiet way men love when they don't have a shared language for feelings. He just didn't know how to tell Mom to tamp down her bias. Some kids rebel when a parent plays favorites. I sharpened edges. I became the dependable one, the list maker, the human clipboard. It worked. It always works until it doesn't. I met Amber at a little salon in Lohi, where I'd been guilted into buying my mother a gift card for Mother's Day. Amber worked the front desk when she wasn't behind a chair. She had a voice like honey stirred into coffee and the smile that made you forget your transaction total. She booked me for a trim I didn't need just to give me a reason to come back. I did. The second time she caught my name without looking at the screen and asked how the steel delivery for the 32nd Avenue site had gone, like she actually cared about my answer. She laughed when I described a crane operator with a death wish and said she liked men who solved problems instead of creating them. I asked her to dinner between the register drawer and the hand lotion display. She said yes. We did the Denver circuit for people who think they invented date night, Union Station oysters, a Rockies game where we pretended to care more about the score than the sunset, green chili in a place with a line out the door, strolls through Reno pointing at murals like we could take credit for them. She told me she did color and extensions and had a list of loyal clients who'd follow her anywhere, but that she wanted to grow into management, maybe open her own place. She liked shiny things, but she wasn't only that. She could talk to anyone. She could make a room forget its rough edges. My friends called her a walking soft opening. When I brought her home to meet my parents, Dad shook her hand and said, "You're the one who got our son to stop answering email during dinner," and Mom hugged her like they were already related. Tyler whistled low and said, "My man," in that brotherly tone that sounds like approval until you learn the subtext. We married inside a year. Not because we had to, just because we wanted the same calendar. Small ceremony at City Park, reception at a brewery and 5 Points with string lights that turned everyone into better versions of themselves in photos. We danced like the floor would disappear if we stopped. Mom cried at the toast and called me her rock and Tyler her sunshine, and for once I felt like being the rock might not be the consolation prize. You can build on a rock. We rented a duplex in West Wash Park where the floors creaked like a polite ghost. Mornings, we'd walk around the lake and point out dogs we would someday adopt when our lives got quieter and our landlord loosened his no pets policy. Nights, I'd get home with the smell of gypsum dust in my hair, and Amber would tell me stories about her clients like little soap operas, the ICU nurse who talked in whispers because she never got off shift before midnight, the real estate agent who booked a blowout every time she had to tell a couple their offer didn't land, the college kid who thought toner was a personality. We were a good team. I did meal prep and screw in light bulbs, she did birthdays and holidays and making sure our lives didn't look like construction staging. When we decided to try for a baby, it wasn't one of those Hollywood montages. It was a conversation at the kitchen counter over chicken and roasted carrots. She said, "I think my clients are right. If we wait for perfect, we'll die waiting." I said, "I can build a timeline with Real Float if we start now." We both laughed because that's who we were. The first 2 months felt like an audition. Our bodies flubbed. Then one Tuesday she came out of the bathroom holding a stick and looking like she was trying not to grin. I picked her up and spun her once like a cliche and promised to be the kind of father who keeps the lights on and the floor warm. She promised to be the kind of mother who keeps the air light and the laughter easy. We made lists of names we wouldn't use because we didn't want to fight, and bookmarked a crib that cost more than our first couch. The pregnancy immediately became a social gravity well. The women at Amber's salon threw around phrases like glow and boy vibes and carried snacks for her like a traveling anti-squad. My guys at work, even the ones with calluses where their rings should be, turned gentle around her belly. Dad started drawing plans on napkins for a crib he wanted to make with my help, the way some men say I love you when they hand you a drill. Mom went on Facebook like it was her job. Tyler showed up more, which should have warmed me. It mostly made me nervous in a way I couldn't yet label. One night at our place, he stood in the kitchen while Amber sliced strawberries and said, "If you need anything, driver, errand boy, president of snacks, you call me." Amber laughed and called him a dork and tossed him a berry. He caught it in his mouth like a seal at SeaWorld. I told myself to stop being a cop in my own house. I'd love to tell you the first red flag was cinematic lipstick on a collar, hotel key under a couch. It was smaller. It was data. The first one came from Amber's Apple Watch. We both use the health app the way people use it when they're building a baby, obsessively, then casually, then not at all when comfort finally outweighs tracking. I was logging groceries into a spreadsheet on a Sunday afternoon. I know, I'm that guy. When I opened her phone to add eggs to our shared list and the health app flashed a notification. No sleep data recorded. No sleep data recorded. Amber had crashed early on the couch, claiming pregnancy exhaustion, and then announced she was too awake to sleep and wanted to take a bath. I had fallen asleep to the sound of water and an episode of a home renovation show lying to me about budgets. The phone said she hadn't worn her watch while sleeping. That's normal enough. Watches get annoying. What hooked my attention was the second notification, route available for outdoor walk. It had auto-detected a walk around 1000 UAM. From our street, down Alameda, then southwest, ending near a parking garage off South Colorado Boulevard. A place with a concierge desk and a lobby with a modern fountain I knew because my company bid on an elevator modernization there last spring. Tyler's building. I sat there holding the phone like it might bite. A man can be jealous and still know when a map is a map. I told myself two things at once. You're inventing a story, and the story might already exist. I didn't say anything to Amber. I put the phone back on the counter, finished my spreadsheet like a man who believes if he completes a row of numbers correctly, the world will snap to attention, and when she came out in a towel, hair twisted up like a soft serve, I kissed her forehead and asked how the bath was. She said hot, then looked at me in that way people do when they're checking whether your face has changed. Mine hadn't, not yet. Once you see a scene, you can't stop pressing it. The next week, Amber told me she had a brand class on Sunday, some product line training the salon requires, downtown at a hotel. She kissed me goodbye in athleisure and took an overnight bag because they're doing demos and my model pays for a room. The invoice that hit our credit card that night didn't match any brand class I'd heard of. Not the salon's usual host, not even a sister property. She'd checked into the Maven at Dairy Block before dinner and ordered room service steak at 10 p.m. I know because the receipts arrived in my email, a side effect of me setting up our shared cards. The Maven sits 2 blocks from a speakeasy Amber loves and 15 minutes by car from Tyler's building depending on traffic. None of this is illegal. None of it is proof. It is just a geometry that makes a particular kind of shape when you draw lines between points. Tyler started texting me more around then, flirty with guilt in the subtext he'd never admit. Yo, big man, you think Dad's grill could handle a brisket if I brought one? You cool with me snagging Amber for a coffee? She wants to pick my brain about Instagram because she says mine looks like a magazine. Tyler's feed had abs, skyline shots, and selfies with bartenders who smiled like he tipped a lot. I said sure. I told myself I was being controlling when what I needed was patience. I kept not sleeping and pretending I was patience. I kept not sleeping and pretending I was. The second Apple Watch anomaly looked like an accident until it didn't. Amber's watch tracked her heart rate like any other. On nights when she said she went to bed early, her resting heart rate usually dipped. On 2 Tuesdays in a row, it spiked around midnight and stayed high for an hour, with notifications the health app calls elevated heart rate during inactivity. She showed no workouts recorded, no dance party, no stress alert. Just a body doing a sprint where a body says it's standing still. I could feel the conspiracy theorist growing like mold in my brain. I forced myself to gather facts the way I would for a wobbly slab, slowly, quietly, with redundancies. I work on the committee that reviews bids for a few properties around the city, and while Tyler's building wasn't one of mine, it shares vendors with one that is. I know the concierge there, Miguel by name. When you bring coffee to a desk twice, you remember faces. One afternoon, I walked in with 2 cups and said the most true lie I've ever told. "Hey, Miguel, I'm doing an informal security audit for a mixed-use property down the street, same elevator vendor you have." The manager asked me to look at the lobby camera angles on a few pier buildings and give feedback on visitor flow. He shrugged like a man who is paid to be helpful and slid a monitor around. I didn't ask to view recordings. I asked to see coverage. While he pulled up the views, he said, "We've had a surprising amount of traffic after midnight lately, man. I keep telling them to increase night staff." He laughed. "Why are the pretty ones always at 1 a.m.? I nodded in the direction of an answer. He clicked through the camera positions, and I saw what I needed: good angles on the elevator bay, face height, timestamps visible. I asked him to print me a skeleton of the visitor log, names redacted, just the number of night entries between midnight and 2 a.m. for the last month, so I could make a case for staffing. He didn't need me to finish the sentence. We both know no one greenlights overtime without a chart. He printed a page with columns of dates and counts. I thanked him, left the coffee he didn't want, and sat in my truck breathing like I'd just run Cherry Creek Trail in steel toes. Amber started using phrases like client nights and brand meetup more. I started using phrases like, "Sure babe," and "take my car, the SUV's safer with the snow." She kissed me with gratitude and took the keys. I took screenshots of Find My Pings and labeled them with a rigor that embarrassed me even as I watched myself do it. The software I am made out of had kicked into incident mode, and I couldn't code switch back into husband. I saw my therapist exactly once during that stretch and told her where I was without telling her where I was. She asked me who taught me that facts are the only way to earn the right to feel. I said my mother, then corrected myself and said my childhood. She said those are not different answers. The fight that put the hairline crack through us was about a baby shower, which is wild because those things are supposed to be harmless pastel nonsense. Mom wanted to throw one for Amber at this rental space in Cherry Creek that pretends to be a garden even in February. Amber wanted something co-ed, less gift-grabby, more party than shower. I didn't care as long as we fed people. We compromised. Backyard of my parents' place if the weather cooperated, or the VFW hall if it didn't. Invite list split between our friends, my extended family, and Amber's work crew. Amber called it a baby bash because she thinks alliteration is a personality trait. Tyler volunteered to MC games, which was both on brand and nauseating. He said, "We'll do a gender reveal with cupcakes. Get one of those cannons that shoot confetti." Mom clapped like she was on a game show. I stood at the edge of the kitchen and felt the room tilt. I said quietly, "Maybe no confetti. I'd rather not pick plastic out of Dad's shrubs until June." Mom rolled her eyes and said, "Eric, don't be a killjoy." Amber said, "He's allowed to be practical. It's why he's hot." Tyler laughed and pointed finger guns at me. The part that made me want to sit on the floor was how much I loved all three of them in the same moment I wanted to call them strangers. Amber's sleep gaps continued to line up with Tyler's nights off in a way that made math look like a language designed for me to suffer. I collected receipts from our card for ride shares that left from points near his complex when she claimed she'd stayed downtown to network with stylists. I caught her in almosts, never in a corner. It's astonishing how long you can live on almosts. There's a version of this story where I confront her right then, in our living room, with the lamp throwing a circle around her like a stage. I ask a question, she lies or she breaks, I move out, or she promises. That would have been kinder in some ways. But the baby in her belly and the mother I grew up with formed an unholy alliance inside me. I kept hearing Mom's voice as I pictured telling her, "You're overreacting, you always do this to Tyler," or "boys will be boys." It made me into something smaller than a man. It made me into a plan. One afternoon, I left work early and drove to a lab in Glendale that does legal paternity testing. There are 2 kinds, the for-your-own curiosity kind you can buy at a pharmacy, and the chain of custody kind, where they take your ID, document your sample, and maintain a record so a court won't laugh at it later. Because the baby wasn't born yet, we were in the world of non-invasive prenatal tests. They draw Mom's blood, they swab the alleged father, and they tell you whose DNA matches the fetal DNA in her bloodstream. It has its critics like any test, but the technology is solid for what it is. Amber had already had blood draws for other prenatal panels. I made an appointment for myself and walked out with a Band-Aid on my cheek and paperwork that felt like a dare. The lab tech said, "Results usually take a couple weeks." I said, "Okay," and tried not to sound like a man timing his future. I did not, at that point, have Tyler's sample. The lab didn't need it to tell me what I needed to know first. They could tell me if I was excluded. If I wasn't, we'd chalk everything up to paranoia and stress, and I would be the one who had to apologize to a woman carrying my child. If I was excluded, then the world would go quiet in a way that meant only one thing. I know what you're thinking. You did this without telling Amber? Yes. Chain of custody meant they needed her consent for the blood draw. She had already signed consent as part of a combined panel because I told her, truthfully, that I wanted to make sure we had as much information about the baby's health as possible. Our OB had explained that the same blood draw could produce multiple panels. I didn't tell Amber I'd added myself to the test for paternity. I don't know if that makes me a villain. I know it makes me someone who needed a mirror that didn't talk. The results came back on a Thursday like any other. I was on site in Lakewood checking a delivery that had to be craned up because the elevator wasn't operational yet. The foreman was yelling about tie-offs, and I was reminding him that gravity doesn't negotiate. My phone buzzed with an email from the lab. I stepped into the stairwell and opened it with a thumb that didn't feel connected to me. It said exactly what a man who needs a new life never wants to read. Alleged father Eric Cole excluded as biological father. Probability of paternity 0.0%. The report used words like excluded and probability with a precision that would have impressed me if it hadn't been aimed at my chest. They included the chain of custody documentation because I'd asked, as if the paperwork could make the sentence less sharp. They noted that additional testing could be conducted with other alleged fathers as indicated. I read it twice, 3 times. The boy in me thought, you could close this right now and pretend the email never arrived. The man in me thought, at least you're holding something true. When I got home that night, Amber was sliding an ultrasound picture into a frame with a little silver border that said, "Coming soon." She looked up at me with a face that somehow made 0.0% feel like a language only I could speak. She said, "Do you think he has your nose?" And then laughed at herself, corrected, said, "Well, parts of you," and kissed my cheek because I had been useful enough to be kissed. I swallowed against a taste like pennies and said, "He'll be perfect either way." I didn't specify either way. I didn't specify either way of what. The picture in the frame looked like every other money-shot sonogram, unimaginable beauty if you ask the right person, gray static if you don't. I wanted to invent a world where this was just a stranger's kind smile. I did not. I sat down, ate the pasta she made, and talked about grout. If you've never lived with a secret shaped like a person, I can't explain the math of those days. People will tell you it's simple: leave, confront, scream, call a lawyer. It's not simple when the person across from you is laughing at a TikTok about dogs in snow and asking what color you want the nursery to be. It's not simple when the father who taught you how to set up post-level calls to talk about Cedar and asks if Amber is sleeping okay. It's not simple when your mother leaves a voicemail telling you she's ordering a cake topper that says, "Oh baby" in cursive, and she pronounces it like a charm. And it's not simple when your brother is in your kitchen eating your leftovers with the confidence of a man who believes he will always be fed. I didn't plan the reveal like a revenge movie villain. I planned it like the most honest thing I know how to do under fluorescent lights, a progress meeting. I told my parents the baby bash would be at their place because the forecast for Saturday looked like Denver remembered how to be kind in March, and because the backyard was big enough for all our wrong calculations. I told Amber I'd handle the cupcakes because the vendor we like, the one on Broadway with the salted caramel frosting that makes you forgive anyone for anything, owed me a favor. I asked Tyler to help with chairs because men who carry chairs feel useful and benign. He said, "On it, Captain," and made a joke about his lower back that made my father and me laugh at a place we would soon hate. On Friday night, I put together a little folder and a bigger envelope. The folder held printouts that would read to anyone else like spreadsheets and maps and random screenshots. To me, they were the story I could no longer pretend wasn't true. Amber's fitness routes traced the same path 3 times in 1 month, always between midnight and 2 a.m., always ending at the parking garage across from Tyler's lobby. The visitor log graph from Miguel's desk showed a spike of entries on those same nights. Our credit card statements sat under a highlighter where the hotel charges and rideshare receipts created their own constellation. I printed out the preliminary paternity report and stuck it in the back of the folder like a spine. I slid the whole thing into a large manila envelope I had my assistant at work label in her tidy hand, "Baby shower surprise per Eric." I asked her to add a sticker that said "Open during reveal" because humor sometimes keeps a man standing. She didn't ask questions. God bless the competent people who don't. I didn't sleep. I lay there listening to Amber breathe and knew I was listening to the last night of a version of my life. At dawn, I made coffee and did the thing my body does when no emotion fits. I swept the kitchen. I texted Dad about the grill. I answered a question from a supplier. I moved through the morning like a man finishing a set of tasks his foreman assigned him. Amber woke up and smiled and said, "Today's going to be so fun," and I said, "It will," and put a kiss on the top of her head gently because if I pressed hard enough, the envelope in the pantry might explode. The backyard looked like a Pinterest board, and that way my mother has always wanted life to look. Dad had strung Edison bulbs along the fence, which made the air feel warm even if the air didn't agree. A borrowed arch waited for photos, draped in greenery that my aunt swore she'd arranged herself even though the florist sticker was still on the bucket. A table sagged under gifts wrapped in craft paper and twine like we were all too cool for polka dots. Amber's friends from the salon arrived in dresses that didn't know what weather was, like happiness could regulate your body temperature. My friends slapped me on the back and brought beer, not because we needed it, but because a man's hands feel wrong empty. Tyler was the first guest to yell my name when I walked out with the cupcakes. He jogged across the lawn like a golden retriever that had not yet been told to heel. He took the tray from me with one hand like he wanted everyone to see he could, then put it down gently and hugged me. "You good, bro?" he asked, a question you can read a dozen ways. I said, "I am," and let him thump my back the way brothers thump when they want to say a thing and know they shouldn't. Mom insisted on a round of corny games before food. The one where people guess due dates and baby weights and write messages on diapers like anyone laughs at 3 a.m. The one where teams race to swaddle a doll like a burrito. Tyler stood in the middle like an event host and turned everything into a joke even when it didn't need one. He was good at it. He's always been good at it. He made the older folks feel seen and the young ones feel flattered, and Amber glow like she was getting a facial from the universe. I stood beside Dad and pretended I was enjoying the bit because, on the surface, I was. That's the trick. Everything looks like a family until the camera pans a half inch to the left. Amber tugged my sleeve when Mom called people toward the dessert table. She whispered, "Ready?" And I said, "Ready?" In the kitchen earlier, I'd slid the envelope behind the cupcakes, not because I wanted to make a scene in the performative sense, but because the entire day was already a scene. If I did this alone in our living room on a Tuesday, it would turn into a war about tone and privacy and timing. If I did it in front of the people who had written this story with us, they'd have to hear the same lines I did. There are arguments you don't win or lose. There are arguments you end. Mom handed me a tiny knife and told me to do the honors. Someone hit play on a playlist that had Baby in every song title. Amber slid her hand into mine and turned our bodies to face the crowd as if we were on a stage. The Edison bulbs hummed. The wind did that Denver thing where it doesn't know it's March. Tyler stood to the side, cradling a confetti cannon like a boy at a parade. My father was a quiet mountain in the back row, hands in his pockets, chin set in the way that always made me feel like if the sky fell, he would hold it up long enough for everyone to get inside. I picked up the envelope instead of the knife. My voice didn't shake. I don't know if that makes me brave or numb. I said, "Thank you all for coming. It means everything to Amber and me." I looked at her when I said both of our names, even though I was about to break something that would never be fixed. She squeezed my hand once like we had arranged a magic trick. I took a breath and said we were going to do a gender reveal. I thought instead we could do a different kind of reveal. Then I opened the flap and slid out the folder, and the room changed in that animal way rooms do when truth walks in wearing boots. The air made a sound when the paper slid free. Not everyone could hear it, but the ones who could shifted on their feet like a storm had reached the backyard. I didn't make anyone wait. You don't pose with a fire alarm, you pull it. I said, "We have something to clear up before anyone spends money guessing at pink or blue." I held up the first page. Not the test yet, not the thing with 0W0 stamped on it like a brand. I held up a map. This is from Amber's fitness app. 3 nights in the last month, the phone registered a walk after midnight from our house to a building on South Colorado. I let the silence eat half the room and then said, "That building is where my brother lives." Someone near the fence coughed. A fork clinked a plate and didn't stop clinking. Amber's hand was still in mine. I could feel the bones arranging themselves into a fist. She said quietly, "Eric, what are you doing?" Like a person waking to find a stranger rearranging her furniture. I moved her hand to the top of the cupcake box like I was putting something fragile down and turned the next page in the folder. Visitor logs. For anyone worried about my ethics, yes, I blurred names. No, I didn't blur dates. These are counts of entries logged between midnight and 2 a.m. at my brother's building. The 3 spikes line up with those 3 walks. Amber pulled her hand back like I'd burned it. She looked at me, then at the crowd, then at me again, like she could still decide who the audience was if she found the right angle. She said, "This is insane. You're making a whole storyboard out of shadows and apps, and this is a baby shower." I nodded once, the way I do when a subcontractor says he can still make a date if we stop talking about weather and start talking about manpower. I said, "I agree about the storyboard, so here are props." I set down a small stack of receipts, rideshare pickups at hours Denver bars call last call, starting within a block of Tyler's building on nights Amber told me she stayed downtown for a brand class. And here's the part that would matter in any room, not just on this lawn. I pulled the report from the back of the folder, the way you draw a nail you've decided not to live with. The lab's letterhead looked official even under party lights. I didn't have to read it. The bold line in the middle spoke for me, excluded as biological father. Probability of paternity, 0.0%. I held it like a man who no longer needed anyone to decide whether his feelings were permitted. I said, "For those worried I'm humiliating a pregnant woman over an insecure imagination, this is a chain of custody paternity report based on Amber's prenatal panel and my sample. I am not the father. The only person here who would benefit from me hiding that fact is my brother." The backyard rearranged itself in time with the words. Laughter from the people near the grill died without saying goodbye. Somewhere, a baby 2 houses over cried on cue like he'd been hired. Tyler broke from his lean against the arch as if the ground had tipped. The confetti cannon tucked under his arm made him look like a clown who'd wandered off on the wrong day. He barked a laugh that missed the landing and said, "Bro, what is this? We're doing Maury in Dad's backyard now? Seriously?" Amber swayed like a person standing on a boat and reached for my wrist. Her nails were cool. "Eric, please, can we go inside and talk? Not," she gestured at the crowd with a little shaking circle, "not like this." Her face did the thing people's faces do when the film of their life melts and they have to improvise a new plot. She looked past me at my mother like a child who knows where the candy is kept, and then past her at my father like she had finally understood which adult in the room made the rules. Mom had one hand over her mouth and the other on a plastic flute of ginger ale. Her eyes said she wanted to be anywhere else, preferably in a memory where the world obeyed the story she had given it. She opened her mouth to say my name the way she has said it, my whole life when she is trying to usher me back onto script, Eric. But Dad's voice passed hers like a truck through an intersection. "Eric, keep going." He didn't ask me if I was sure. He didn't ask me to be nice. He looked at me like a man who recognizes the job being done whether or not he'd have chosen the method. Tyler found his swagger like a person locating a jacket he'd thrown on a chair. He should not have found it. He did anyway. He raised both hands like a referee and said, okay, let's all relax. Absence of proof is not proof of anything. You know how these apps glitch. Maybe her phone took a ride without her." He threw in a grin I've watched get him out of tickets and into beds. "And about the test?" Amber's voice cut across his like a snapped chalk line. Don't you talk about that like it's a..." She looked back at me, eyes wet in a way that wasn't performance. "This is between us, Eric." I wanted to say a sentence I'd rehearsed in my head, but never out loud. It was between us, until you brought my brother into it. I didn't. The thing about truth is that it doesn't need all your lines. I held the report up one more time and then set it down. The top cupcake in the box had a swirl of frosting like a small storm. The knife my mother had handed me lay on the table with the quiet threat of any tool. I reached for the confetti cannon at Tyler's elbow and took it gently. He looked at me like he wasn't sure if I was going to break it over his knee. I replaced it on the table next to the knife. I said, "There's a time for private and there's a time for daylight. I didn't do this because I like an audience. I did it because there's a baby whose first chapter shouldn't be started with a lie." I turned my body to face Tyler fully for the first time all afternoon. "Did you sleep with my wife?" For a second, he looked like a boy who had kicked a ball through a window and was about to invent wind as a suspect. Then his chin came up, that half inch I know too well. "She came to me," he said, "empty as a parking lot. She was lonely. You were never home." The ugliest part wasn't what he said. The ugliest part was the way he tilted his head toward the crowd, like he wanted someone to nod along, like the world would clap if he said it smooth enough. Dad stepped forward until he was close enough to feel the breath coming off our faces. He didn't raise his voice. That has always been his power. He said, "Get off my property," to my brother, the same way he has said, "Check the level." Tyler flinched like he hadn't expected the call to go against him in the house where he had always been the season favorite. He looked at Mom and found no help there. She had turned into one of those statues that only cry when no one is looking. He tried to make a joke out of leaving, tossed in and, "All right, okay, we're going, calm down," like any of this was a misunderstanding. Then something in his face fell, the way light falls when a cloud finally stops pretending to be decoration. He looked at me as if I could make my father allow him to stay. I didn't. He left through the side gate in a silence that wasn't silence because all around us, plastic plates were whispering and shoes were looking at the grass too hard. Amber didn't move. She stood between the table and me like a person at a counter waiting to be served a sentence. The salon friends formed a cluster of hair and perfume and wounded air behind her. Someone said, "Girl, let's go inside." And someone else said, "Eric, you're not doing this right." And my mother said nothing because she had finally met a day she couldn't narrate into the version she preferred. Amber spoke into the quiet like a small bell. I made a mistake. It sounded insane hearing the word mistake try to do the work of a wrecking ball. My voice surprised me by not breaking. I said, "Then I won't make another. I'm filing to disestablish paternity before the birth, and I'm retaining counsel for divorce. This baby deserves to know who made him. He deserves a father who shows up as the thing he actually is, not the one who is too polite to correct the paperwork." Amber's face went through 3 emotions, then landed on a kind of terrible calm. She nodded once, like she understood we had reached the ocean, and arguing about the sand would not change the tide. Mom tried then. She stepped forward with a hand out like a traffic cop who believes she directs storms. "Eric, baby, you don't have to decide today. There are options." The word options made me want to laugh and throw up at the same time. Dad did the thing he has done exactly twice in my life. He touched my mother's forearm in front of other people and guided her backward gently. He said, "Enough," and it worked on everyone in a 20-foot radius. People peeled away the way people do when a party ends without a toast. The aunt with the truth or twine gift wrapped in craft paper set it quietly in the grass by the table like a peace offering and walked to her car. The neighbor went to help Dad coil extension cords he hadn't unplugged yet. Someone picked up the diaper messages and dropped them in the trash without reading a single love joke. My friends hugged me with the kind of grip that means they don't know what to say and are saying it anyway with bones. Amber's coworkers looked at her like they'd fallen asleep in a salon chair and woken up in a courtroom. One of them squeezed her hand so tight she winced. She pulled away, walked up to me and said, "You're going to hear everything anyway, so hear it from me. I ended it. Weeks ago, I was going to tell you." I don't know what mattered about the verb tense, but she needed it like oxygen. I said nothing because there is no past tense that makes 0.0 turn into a rounding error. She left with a friend, not my brother, which was the kindest thing she did all day. The cleanup felt like, after a storm, everyone much more competent than the damage they were addressing. Dad and I folded chairs because men who fold chairs sometimes don't cry. He said quietly, "I'll call an attorney I trust. We'll make sure they don't put your name on anything it shouldn't be on." I nodded. We stacked tables. We took down the arch like a thing that had clearly failed in its job. Mom hovered and didn't hover well. When all that was left was a bare patch of lawn with the outline of a celebration on it, Dad went inside and came out with the crib plans he'd sketched on napkins, and then transferred to paper like a proper project. He put them on the table like a map from a town that had burned. "Let's make a bench," he said. It felt like a blessing and a burial at once. The next weeks were phones and signatures. In Colorado, the law is built to presume the husband is the father. You have to file to say what's true. My attorney was a woman who didn't waste nouns. We petitioned the court for a pre-birth order acknowledging the test to avoid my name landing on a birth certificate where it didn't belong. Amber retained counsel of her own. When we sat at a table across from each other under fluorescent lights that make everyone look like paperwork, she didn't cry. She looked like what happens to a person when the story gets tired of toddlers and starts speaking adult. She said, "I will not contest disestablishment." Her lawyer nodded to underline the sentence. "There are different kinds of mercy. Some come from the person who hurt you deciding not to stab twice." My mother tried to set up a family meeting. She called it healing, which is a beautiful word people sometimes use like duct tape. I told her we could try after the filings were done. She said, "You can't unbrother a man," and I said, "Watch me." The first time I said that sentence out loud, I felt hollow for a whole day. The second time I said it, I slept through the night. The test lab sent a follow-up because everything official loves a follow-up. We arranged testing for Tyler and Amber to confirm what the math already had. He tried to balk about chain of custody, asked to use some other lab he trusted, which made my attorney's left eyebrow rise half an inch. He shut up when her right one joined it. The result came back with a number that, years ago, I would have thought looked like love, probability of paternity, 99 something. Funny. how numbers can mean opposite things depending on whose name they sit next to. I didn't need to see it, and I did anyway. I felt relief like a clean cut. It hurts less than a tear. Work saved me by not caring that my secrets had teeth. Schedules needed to be made whether or not a marriage was a math problem you couldn't solve. Dad and I built the bench on 2 Sundays and 1 late night. Cedar slats, a back that looked more like a statement than a seat, arms you could set a drink on. We carved the date into the underside of the left arm with a cheap wood burner and didn't tell anyone. He stained it the color of something that's been okay longer than it hasn't. When we carried it into his backyard, we set it where the arch had been, not as a replacement, but as a correction. Mom came out and put a blanket over the back of it like that could keep it from being chilly, and then went back inside because she didn't know yet that some benches are for sitting with the truth, not covering it up. The divorce moved at the speed paperwork moves, when the facts are simple and the feelings are not a party to the case. Amber and I divided what could be divided and sold what couldn't. She offered to return the ring. I told her to sell it and use the money for something the baby would actually need, which was the closest I could come to saying a blessing I meant. Once I caught myself composing a text to her that started with, "Remember when we," and ended with a memory about green Chile and rain on a Thursday. I deleted it. There are doors you close without slamming because the slam is about you and the close is about everyone else. When the baby arrived, my phone lit up from half a dozen sources like a fire alarm. You can't shut off even if you don't live in the building anymore. Amber's friend posted a photo of a pink screaming bundle, and the comments turned the world into a chapel for a minute. "Healthy lungs," someone wrote with a heart emoji I could feel through the screen like a bruise. My mother texted a picture of her holding him, eyes red not because of the newborn's weight, and typed, "You should come meet him," and then typed, "Sorry," immediately after, as if she had stepped on my foot in church. I told her to tell Amber congratulations. Mom wrote back, "He has your hands," and then 10 minutes later, "I'm sorry, I don't know why I said that." It was muscle memory. I put the phone down and went outside and sat on the bench we built and let the wind decide what my face looked like from far away. 2 days after the first time Mom held him, Tyler called me. It was a number I knew better than I wanted. I watched it ring 3 times like it might decide to be someone else if I waited. I answered on the 4th because I am not a child, and because avoiding him had become a habit I didn't want to turn into a personality. He didn't say hello. He said, "They cut me off. Straight lines, no swag, no sideways." He sounded like a man who had learned a new verb and didn't like it. I said, "That was their call." He said, "You could tell them to chill. You could stop acting like I killed somebody." I said, "You didn't kill anybody. You just made a person and lied about how." He swore softly because softness is what happens to a man's voice when he runs out of jokes. He said, "I don't know what I'm doing." He didn't cry. He said he won't stop crying at night. He laughed a little, the bad kind. "I haven't slept. She's wrecked." Amber's mom is helping some, but I don't know if he wanted me to picture him walking but I don't know if he wanted me to picture him walking the floor with that boy who could stop. I did anyway. I pictured the way babies smell like laundry baskets in the ocean at the same time. I pictured my brother in his nice apartment being taught a curriculum. All decent men get taught, eventually, if they're lucky, and if they're not, the world has to sit next to them on a bus later. He finally said the sentence, I knew he would. "Can you help me figure this out?" I did not say, "You figured it out fine at midnight with her." I did not say, "Ask Mom to cut your meat for you and pay your rent and coordinate your naps." I said the thing that had been sitting in my mouth like a stone since the backyard. From now on, he's your responsibility. I didn't hang up. I didn't preach. I didn't fix. I listened to him breathe. Then I said, start by telling the truth in every room you walk into. Start by being awake when he is. Start by paying for what you break. He said, okay, like a person translating a word he didn't use to know. We hung up without a final act. Mom tried the meeting again a month later, and this time I said yes. We sat at their kitchen table with the bench visible through the window like a Greek chorus that only speaks in wood. Tyler looked smaller. That's the brutal grace of nights without sleep. Amber didn't come. She had sent a message through my mother asking me to forgive her someday, and I had told my mother to tell her I forgave her now. Forgiveness is not reconciliation. It is not a restart. It is the quiet closing of a book that was on fire in your hands. Dad said, I rewrote the trust. He didn't flourish it. He said it like a ledger item he wanted on the agenda. Tyler looked down. He said, I know. Mom swallowed like a person choking on a past she'd curated. Dad looked at me. He said, your mother and I are still your mother and I. The old sentence, the one about not unbrothering a man, sat in the corner and behaved for once. The new sentence took its place like a foreman who had fired the old one for cause. There will still be birthdays, there will still be Sundays, there will not be pretending. I started running again, slower than my pride liked and farther than my sadness thought it could go. I stopped tracking everything down to the step and started noticing the birds who think they own the morning. I hired the therapist whose eyebrows had spoken in depositions and let her talk me into purchasing a plant I would have killed a year ago. It's alive as I say this. I moved out of the duplex into a one-bedroom in Baker where the floors don't creak because there is nothing left to confess. On a Saturday, I drove to Golden to watch the kayakers pretend the river was doing what they wanted, and I brought a sandwich that tasted like I didn't owe anyone a speech. The bench in my parents' yard grayed out into the color cedar turns when it understands it isn't a brand new idea anymore. If you sit on it after dinner, it gives in the right places. We earned that. You might be wondering if the public part was necessary. I think about it more than you think I do. I replay my mother's face sometimes, and that makes me care what you imagine I feel. I didn't set out to make a spectacle. I set out to put the truth on a table that had hosted so many versions of us that I had started to think we were a picture. Pictures don't change, people do. The baby needed a world where the paperwork matched the cradle. My father needed a world where his sons were the men he had prepared them to be, or at least where the record showed who they were while the concrete was wet enough to rewrite. I needed a world where I could sleep. A week ago, I saw Amber at the grocery store. She had the baby with her in one of those carriers that turn you into a kangaroo. He was asleep like he'd invented it. She looked tired and pretty and like a person. For a second, the part of me that hates change wanted to walk to the end of the aisle and come back and pretend we'd never collided. I didn't. I walked up, said, "Hey," and we both flinched at the normal word. She said, "He likes the sound of the freezer section. White noise." I said, "Good taste." She smiled like maybe we had both stepped out of costume. She said, "Do you want to hold him?" It felt like one of those moral riddles with no wrong answer and no right one. I said, "Not today. Tell him his uncle says hi." I didn't know if uncle was a demotion or a promotion or just the right noun. She nodded like I'd said something that made sense. She said, "He'll know who you are." The sentence made me stand there looking at a frozen bag of peas until she turned the cart and stepped into the next chapter without asking my permission. I went home and sat on my balcony and looked at the kind of sunset Denver sells to people who think happiness is a horizon. I thought about Tyler holding a baby at 3 a.m. and me at a bench at 8 p.m. and Amber at noon choosing bananas with one hand because the other hand is keeping a life attached to her chest. I thought about my mother learning how to love both sons in the same truth. I thought about my father staining a piece of cedar like it was a vote. And then, because the human heart refuses to be only a courtroom, I thought about the day the baby will walk and the way we will all applaud like we had anything to do with it. If you've heard this and you're angry on my behalf, I appreciate the energy. Please spend it on your own boundaries. If you're angry at me for doing this in daylight, that's fair. The thing about daylight is you can see the dust. You can also see what you're building. I choose to build a life I can walk through without fear of where the floor gives. That's a PM's prayer and a husband's regret hooked together with finish nails and maybe, if unlucky, a little forgiveness. What would you have done at that backyard table? Would you have opened the envelope? Or kept the reveal private and risked the paperwork writing a lie into a child's first document? Tell me in the comments. If this story made you think about where the line between privacy and truth belongs in a family, hit like, subscribe, and share it with someone who needs to hear where boundaries begin and where they break.